Okay. I thought we would get started. I'm going to keep this very informal. I just wanted to both welcome Daphne. This is a gathering of your fan club. I'm not going to do the formal introduction, but I did want to just say that this Daphne is sort of inaugurating what is our kind of Life of Sound public programming. It's a series of programs tied to a collaborative research seminar that we're teaching here at the Townsend Center. A group of faculty, group of us, Michael Lucy, Tom McEnany, Fumi Okiji, where's Roshi? Roshi, Kechi, and where is, and Beth, I'm sorry, I'm looking for you all around the room. Where 6 of us are teaching a graduate seminar on the life of sound, and all the students are here. But I just wanted to mention, we will be having 2 more events this semester. Tanya Linkletter will be at BAM PFA on open rehearsals on the 1st and 2nd. And then December 30th in the Mod 5, November 30th in the Mod 5, Valeria Luiselli and her team will be presenting their Borderlands project. So that will be on a Thursday evening. So without further ado, I've asked my colleague, Tom McEnany, to introduce Daphne. So thanks for coming.
So it's my pleasure and an honor to be asked to introduce Daphne Brooks. Dr. Daphne A. Brooks is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University. That list of departmental affiliations alone testifies to the breadth and reach of her research, her teaching, and her writing. The expansiveness of her work stretches out across her numerous articles and academic journals and volumes, as well as popular venues like the New York Times, The Guardian, Pitchfork, and many other publications. All of them are written with verve and vibrancy, with vast archives of knowledge transmuted into stirring prose on topics like See My Face from the Other Side, Freedom is a Blueswoman's Prerogative, Toni Morrison and the Music of Black Life, Why Radiohead are the blackest white band of all time, Betty Davis, Grace Jones, and the Art of Anti-Confessional Cinema, and How Black Lives Matter Started a Musical Revolution. Brooks is also the award-winning author of liner notes, not the book liner notes, I'll talk about that in a second, but liner notes for The Complete Tammy Terrell and Take a Look, Aretha Franklin Complete on Columbia, each of which has won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for Outstanding Music Writing. And in the last few years, she also authored the liner notes for Prince's Sign of the Times Deluxe Box Set and Omnivore Records reissues of Nina Simone's early records on Bethlehem. And we haven't even gotten to her books. In addition to important edited collections, she is the author of 3 monographs, Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, from 2006, which won the Errol Hill Award for Outstanding Scholarship on African American Performance from the American Society for Theater Research. She's the author of the 33 1/3 book about Jeff Buckley's album Grace, and of course, the monumental liner notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound from 2021, which has won 11 awards, including from the Museum for African American History, the American Society for Theater Research, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and most important here is obviously the 2021 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Nonfiction. And I should also note that Professor Brooks is a Bay Area native who received her BA from this very university. Yet this highly abridged CV, for all its accolades, hardly begins to do justice to the critical passion that drives Dr. Brooks's reimagination of the possibilities of writing about music, literature, sound, and popular culture. So instead of trying to summarize her work, I just say that when it comes to the life of sound, Brooks's writing counters histories that have overlooked, misheard, or misunderstood Black women's central role in both creating and theorizing modernity through a multiplicity of performative modes. While sound studies scholars have focused on media like the phonograph, the radio, the vocoder, and others to explore how material practices invent the so-called soundscape of modernity, Daphne asserts that the Black women musicians she writes about, quote, figure themselves as the medium, as records and recorders, whose sonic creations double as theoretical statements. She's attuned to the material history of technologies and the social life of how sounds circulate, the multi-scalar modes that connect industry decisions to the embouchure one uses on an instrument. But she also refuses the binary between aurality and creation. It's not just that these Black women listen in detail, but they make music from that listening, thereby unfolding critique and interpretation into the work of their recordings and performances. Their sonic acts are the evidence of their critical listening, intellectual engagements with histories of subjugation and uplift, intentional interventions into the archives, digging through crates to witness and transform history through a shift in pitch or rhythm, a new inflection that makes not just Afro-sonic modernity, but modern culture at large actually happen in movement. Brooks's notion of performative epistemology recognizes how Black women from Zora Neale Hurston to Abby Lincoln to Janelle Monáe and so many others have not only interwoven text and sound, but also used the phonic elements of their work to unsettle the authority of the graphic. The result in each case is a new style, and when she writes the white Jewish blues and jazz historian Rosetta Reitz that she, quote, cultivated a new critical language and lens through which we might engage these artists, Daphne seems to be theorizing her own writing. Her writing, too, is a new style, deeply historical, archival, and theoretical, but also agile, funny, and moving. And the accessibility of this style at home in academic journals and popular magazines complements an argument that migrates across her work to assert that popular music, music she shows that has been primarily driven by Black women, is not just the entertaining fuel of modernity, but the most sophisticated, nuanced, and intricate theorization and critical response to history in our unfolding present. Rather than the post-critical, Professor Brooks's writing and subject and style demonstrates how sustaining community, creating a different kind of hope in the dark, is a critical project, but one where the major moods of joy, passion, and pleasure are key. And I'll just say that I know that this joy carries into the classroom because she was generous enough last year to give a lecture in a guest lecture in one of my classes, and by the end of it, she was up and dancing, and half the room was up and dancing, which has never happened in a lecture hall that I've witnessed before. So by way of closing this introduction and handing the mic to Daphne, I just want to read from a poem, a short poem, Harriet Mullen's poem Eurydice, which has echoed in my head as a kind of companion piece to her writing, to Daphne's writing, ever since I first read liner notes. Eurydice. Can't wait to be sprung from shadow, to be known from a hole in the ground. Scarcely silent, though often unheard. Winding, wound, wounded wind. She turned and turns. She opens. Keep the keys, that devil told her. Guess the question, dream the answer. Tore down almost level. A silence hardly likely. Juicy voices pour them on. Music sways her. She concedes. As darker, she goes deeper. Please join me in welcoming Daphne Brooks.
Okay. Okay. Tom McEnany, you make me cry. Come on, man. Separated at birth, man. Tom McEnany. Okay. Wow. I have a lot of thank yous. I was raised by incredible people who taught me a lot about being about the ethics of gratitude, and so I do want to thank Tom for many things. He's such a great colleague from afar. I'm so thrilled that we know each other now. I want to thank the great Professor Best for leading the way and hosting me and leading the Townsend Center, which is such an extraordinary community. I want to thank the superhero Michaela for assisting with all things. Eric, tech people are always my best friends, so God bless you. I want to thank the Departments of African American Studies, TDPS, and Music, and the Life of Sound Ensemble of Thinkers for being in the round with me this week. This place is so special to me. I learned so many things about how to think and how to read and how to write and how to be out in the streets and how to pull that all together. So I'm very humbled to be here. I want to say one logistical note. This talk runs right now around 61 minutes, right? So, we all have things to do. You're probably going to see me leaping like FloJo at some point through some of the material coming up later, but we'll see how much we get through it. And finally, I want to dedicate this talk to Barbara Kristen and to my late mother, Juanita Catherine Watson Brooks, who passed away on Toni Morrison's birthday this year. Let's see what we can do together.
I'm yours. Wait a
The tumult is palpable and it's written all over the voice, spilling like a wildfire across the ravages of an instrument pushed to the very limit, asked to do the work, to do the spectacular labor of harboring history, of safe housing the desires and competing forces of men and women who need and demand everything of it, who see and hear and imagine their own futures, their own futures, who see and hear and imagine their own futures as bound up in what this vocal role can bear for the makings of the modern world. Just a hair over 10 years ago now, the greatest theater actress of the last quarter century told us as much in an NPR interview in which she enumerated the physical and technical challenges tied to inhabiting the role of a lifetime, that of the titular heroine in Porgy and Bess, Gershwin and Hayward's operatic whale of a show. To fully commit to Bess, Audra McDonald notes, one has to be willing to be used up by the forces bearing down on our girl, our reformed and then fallen again femme fatale, the pariah of this infamous tale of poor Black Southern Jim Crow era ill-fated lovers and catastrophic strife, the woman who suffers multiple violations and does battle with many demons before finally being swallowed up by her own addictions. The arc of her turmoil is manifest, says Broadway's reigning genius actor, in the notes we hear her aiming to hit by the time Porgy and Bess reaches one and a series of naders. It's at the moment when Bess and her ex-lover turned town predator Crown embark on a fraught duet that tests the limits of a performer's ability. When Bess and Crown are singing What You Want with Bess, McDonald's muses, she's on Kittiwah Island trying to get away from him so she can catch that boat and get back to Catfish Row. And she's struggling to get him off of her. And she's been singing in her middle voice, and it's fairly loud, but it's in a duet moment. And then after all that struggle, at the very, very end of the duet, she has to hit her highest, hardest moment. Her highest, hardest moment, one in which McDonald in the 2012 Broadway revival would open the floodgates of her own vocal prowess night after night, tearing through her wrenching and emphatic reading of her character's much contested personhood, is the byproduct of a score and a libretto steeped in casual racial and gender brutalities, that which is cross-faded into the form, the content, the plot structure, the strategies of characterization constitutive of the original 1935 Porgy and Bess, the hybrid opera meets musical opus hatched out of the minds of composer George Gershwin, librettist Ira Gershwin, and novelist turned librettist DuBose Hayward.
Wow. No woman could kick me in the street, and when you want it.
Lyric soprano does backflips in this number, one shaped by the original's dynamic fluctuations of tempo and tonal center, as Gershwin biographer Howard Pollack notes. Her performance showcases her trademark ability to yoke together muse phrasing, swing, and operatic fervor, sometimes in a single lyric line. Even still, it's clear to at least this listening here that her singular abilities are put to the dramaturgical test as she engages in a nearly 100-year dual battle that has held my attention for some years now. The one waged by Bess in the context of Hayward and the Gershwins' racial naturalism, sonic fantasia, and the simultaneous struggle, which a remarkable array of artists who suited up as this character, who've covered and recovered her aesthetic afterlives, have had to confront and manage. Those stark dualities, which are woven into the originating texture of Corgan Bess, when, for instance, Northern classically trained Black actors were first asked to perform white ideas about impoverished Southern Blackness in an operatic register. So those kinds of stark dualities and dizzying ambiguities are especially apparent in the form and the content of a number in which the physical escalation of Bess's fear and aggravation, apparent in the arc of MacDonald's deft and formidable vocals, which plumb aching depths and pivot to quick fire reaching, unfold synchronously with Juilliard alum beast of a singer's rendering of Hayward's 1935 illogical notions of Black dialect, still baked after all these years into the lyrics of the show. The ugliness of her own inevitable abjection is what this song, which appears late in the 3-hour-plus show, requires of the character Bess, even in spite of the fact that MacDonald and 21st century Black feminist librettist Suzanne Lori Parks and director Diane Paulus did their damnedest to build into their version of the production a few potential loopholes of retreat for their heroine to seek shelter. This staging of What You Want with Bess, for instance, supplies added dialogue, enabling her to make the case for choosing Porgy rather than immediately and inexplicably succumbing to Crown's advances. It provides her with lines declaring her desire to actively name Porgy as her one, to make her way home to him, to make a home with him. Yet the original song's likening of a woman to a dog are still left in place here, as is the culminating and heavily implied sexual violence that punctuates Act 2, Scene 2's end on the other side of the song. The battle with the material itself is, for MacDonald and the generations of women who came before her, a meta-narrative in and of itself. I've been doing an entire night of heavy, full throttle singing, says MacDonald. And the last song I'm singing, Summertime, after screaming and being raped and beaten, I have to sing high and pretty, end quote. And here it is worth allowing MacDonald herself to elaborate on the situation at hand. Me and tech.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross.
Oh.
My guest, Audra McDonald,
no,
is
no,
nominated for a
No,
Tony.
Terry, no. Wow.
And he told me all about working with Simon Rattle and how incredible the experience was. And I said, what about Bess? And he said, it's a voice killer. He said, it's a very difficult role in a voice killer. And I remember hearing that and just going, oh.
Is he right? Is it a voice killer?
It's pretty close. It's very difficult. There's very few quiet moments for Bess. They're all very big, very emotional, and very rangy. And to commit to that night after night after night is very difficult.
Can you just give us an example of one of the twists in one of the songs that makes it so difficult?
As a good example, I would use What You Want with Bess, where she's singing with Crown and she's on Kittiwah Island and she's trying to get away from him so she could catch that boat and get back to Catfish Row. And she's struggling to get him off of her. And she has been singing in her middle voice, like now and forever. He can't live without me. He would die without me. You know, oh, Crown, won't you let me go? And it's fairly loud, but it's in a duet moment. And then after all of that struggle, at the very, very end of the duet, she has to hit her highest, hardest moment. And there's been so much physical struggle that has happened up until that point that by the time you get to that moment, for me, I feel like I have run a marathon, and that's when I have to hit my highest, longest sustained note. And it about kills me every night. I always wonder, am I going to get there? Am I going to hit some note, a fourth lower?
Today is a killer, as Nina Simone might say. Keep in mind in this number, the agony on display here is that of a heroine assigned all of the monikers indicative of vice and criminality bequeathed to her by those aforementioned ambitious white creatives at the helm of this production. She comes to us as the strumpet, the whore, the loose woman, the junkie who struggles oh so helplessly with ex-lover crown, a cartoonish brute, according to Hayward's libretto, a coarse amalgamation of anti-Black ideas about Black masculinity, according to Jim Crow logic. Having freed herself from his clutches at the opera's opening, having found fleeting solace in the arms of disabled street beggar Porgy, only to have it all fall apart in the hands of two villains, one who here violates her physically, and the other, that of Sporden life, the dope peddler pimp who preys on and exploits her emotional vulnerabilities and addictions. We find her as the show begins to speed towards its denouement, grasping for her own peace of mind in her summertime reprise before dropping to the depths of a final dark resolve. Yes, this is opera tragedy in the grand tradition of the form. Think Bizet and Verdi. Think, God help us, Wagner, the latter of whom Gershwin most surely did, as Pollock points out. And this tradition was something that the architects of Porgy and Bess were squarely aiming for when they first set upon transforming Hayward's 1925 novel into a classical meets popular music epic, with Ersatz Black vernacular forms liberally interpolated into its lyrics, dialogue, and score. But the Gershwin and Hayward collaboration is also a project steeped, as I'll be discussing this afternoon, in specific anti-Black and misogynist language and discourse, so frequently elided or disregarded or oversimplified in Porgy and Bess studies, that to speak of these acutely apparent dilemmas to those fans or longtime old school dyed-in-the-wool scholars of the show often elicits eye rolls. In the case of one Otto Preminger scholar whom I chatted up in 2019 after a Lincoln Center screening of the film, defensiveness in the case of one Pulitzer Prize winning superstar playwright whom I otherwise adore, Angels in America, or absolute incredulity in the case of one DuBose Hayward archivist whom I met in South Carolina just the week before last. All of these reactions are a reminder to me of the importance of doing this work, the work of dissecting the scale of the problem that is Porgy and Bess, and the extent to which it is a phenomenon indicative and reflective of both Gershwin and Hayward's roaring 20s, their own self-described jazz age, their own lost generation, their racial modernist and Charleston Renaissance good times, as well as the times that at least one of them inherited by way of family lore and trade and American historical conflagrations that haunted the ruling class. Today, I'm suggesting that we wade through this thicket of historical formations and textual experiments and racial and gender representation, all awash in the music, literature, and particularly resonant in theater projects made by both men. Much of my commentary today on George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward will focus on the latter and his relations, the lesser known and less regarded of the two. But make no mistake, the aim here is to ultimately trace the weight and thickness of this cultural sedimentation produced by both men, that which Black women artists had to make sense of, had to choose to dissect, had to imaginatively pry apart and disrupt, and sometimes altogether destroy in making their own artistry and aesthetic pursuits audible and legible to the masses. To listen to Audra McDonald's reading of What You Want with Bess is to be made privy to a ritualistically exhaustive endeavor. And what I hope will become clear through my remarks is also a transgenerational string of theatrical choices, compositional aspirations, and sociopolitical, historical, and cultural obsessions possessed by this creative duo, really a trio, but really, I mean, Ira was kind of just hanging out. He did some stuff, but really, okay. This creative duo and grafted under the scriptings of this character Bess's sonic ontology. To make this artistic statement repeatedly and night after night, performance after performance requires sacrifice, a willingness and an ability to countenance varying modes of white supremacist violence cross-faded into the text at hand. It requires inventive dramaturgical recourse and an ability to tap into one's most heterogeneous performance scales to be able to, for instance, sing in wide vocal ranges and with great physical stamina, folk, Broadway, opera, and spirituals, while also responding to the narrative's aesthetic call to simultaneously reinscribe the most familiar Black female characters. To inhabit this role requires the risk of physical, of artistic ruin, the risk of an emptying out of all of the performance resources at one's disposal with no guarantee of rehabilitation or repair. This is how the Gershwins and Hayward designed it to be so all those years ago in the feverish early 1930s exchanges between George and DuBose, when they circled back and forth to each other after some half a dozen years of pondering a collaboration that might burnish their respective attempts at stardom. If Gershwin imagined that the production of classical masterworks might elevate him from his humble song plugger turned vaudeville hustling roots to becoming America's foremost composer, Hayward, such a creepy photograph, equally held hopes of translating his mid-20s best-selling novelist turned Broadway playwright turned screenwriter successes and his associations with a white racial dialect revival into putative cultural seriousness and highbrow acclaim. To capitalize on Blackness as the wished-for realization of their own avant-gardism, that meant that they were joining the party that Eugene and Gertrude and Virgil and Carl and all the rest of the crew were well in the mix of stirring up as a modernist resolve, as generations of critics have effectively shown. Each man's, Gershwin's and Hayward's, interest in Blackness is well noted, and in many ways de rigueur in the story of the white modern primitivism game, but in the fixation on a particular fantasy of Black womanhood that would fully come to fruition in the figure of Bess, is, it turns out, a much longer story, one that spans early theatrical and musical experimentations for one of these men, volatile family history with regards to the other, and social, political, and cultural histories tied to both of them. Their investment in the creation and capital expenditure of Bess is, by my mind, the story of America, replayed within the workings of American theater and popular music culture. It is the story of what cultural domination sounds like if we would just listen out for it. It is the exemplification of white supremacy and misogyny as form and aesthetic as it traveled across repertoires and genres of influence and ended up in the mouths of Black actors. To listen in this way to the history of Porgy and Bess is to tell the story of white artistic rhapsodic effusion in relation to ideas about Black life. It's to tell the story of white interest in the dramatization of Black suffering as extravagant and rapturous, as synonymous with the rhapsodic form itself, a collection of contrasting moods and colors, bristling with spontaneity and notions of improvisation. It means telling a story of colonial wonder and anti-Black repulsion, predictably masked as paternalistic affection and admiration. It means telling the story of disaster and destruction, the ruinous effects of violent caricature, the catastrophic afterlives of Atlantic world slavery, and the cycles of trauma born out of the brokenness of America. It means confronting, as I do in the larger project, the ways that the performers who took on Bess so often devised plots to explode their own reproductive labor in the theatrical marketplace. Pace Hartman in her meditative Belly of the World, a note on Black women's labors. If, as she reminds, with regards to the logic of slavery and its afterlives, reproduction, quote unquote, does not ensure any future other than that of dispossession, or guarantee anything other than the replication of racialized and disposable persons of human increase, expanded property holdings for the master, then how does this come to bear in the marketplace of performance? Let me be clear that I do not wish to propose any sort of feckless conflation of the conditions of forced sexual reproduction and labor endured by the enslaved with that of the agential theatrical labor of their descendants. But I do want to suggest that we take seriously the ways that a production like Porgy and Bess so often turned Black actors and Black women actors in particular into factories that threatened to reproduce the sound of Blackness as objection, and likewise locked them out of the arts marketplace of the auteur to which Gershwin and Hayward so aspired. She provides so much, to cite and rephrase Hartman once more, yet rarely does she thrive. Her care, her articulation of intimacy, her sustenance as an artist, exploited under racial capitalism, are reminders of a legacy of resourceful innovation and dogged aesthetic renovation, as Meta Jones might put it, of material that never held enough space for their ample imaginative authorship, counter narratives, and Black feminist logics. The searing power of their complex and varied work across the ages attests to all of the ways that the Black woman, as Kimberly Juanita Brown puts it, is both an entity imbued with a history of infliction and is yet fully capable of considering herself deserving of a recognized history. Such claims are, to me, the missing links to more nuanced and urgent ways of reading the lasting legacies of Porgy and Bess, called America's first and greatest opera, but one which we might yet reconsider as the stubborn blueprint for our cultural life in America, with the expenditure of Black women's creative labor at its very beating heart center. Ooh, I didn't know I would do that. Rhapsody begins with a tease an abrupt invitation to linger for no more than a moment. Oh. That up there. Invitation to linger for no more than a moment, the billowy flutter of a flirtatious thrill. In 1924 at New York's Yale Hall, George Gershwin, the maker with big designs on vaulting out of vaudeville and into the concert hall grammar of elegance, begins the piece that would transform the direction of his short career in the register of both seduction and weariness. A clarinet glissando synonymous with the languor and steaminess of precoital mating calls, of postcoital exhaustion, and other bedroom rituals moves swiftly out of the window of cramped tenement housing into the bustling streets below, where European immigrant hustle meets the grandeur of metropolitan possibility framed by color line encounters, charged interracial socialities, and the dizzying opportunity to make art and commerce out of this noisy urban experiment. That experiment, the composer's first smash jazz concerto, is one still stirring up accolades some 99 years after its debut and still referred to by music critics as a sonic manifestation of the American dream. This is the kind of myth-making of which Gershwin himself famously participated in the weeks, months, and years following his composition's breakthrough debut on February 12, 1924 at New York City's Yale Hall, when orchestra leader Paul Whiteman premiered his work as the centerpiece of his experiment in modern music endeavor. It's the rhythms of a locomotive, Gershwin would insist years later, which shook something loose in him while traveling from New York to Boston, sparking in him a vision of a definite plot of the piece, a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, quote unquote, a symphonic rendering of a, quote, vast melting pot, our unduplicated national past, or blues our metropolitan madness, end quote. Only mildly implicit here is the suggestion that the shtetl and the ghetto, so to speak, would have to mix it up in this piece in order to capture this modern moment like lightning in a bottle. Son of Russian Jewish immigrant parents, George Gershwin makes here remarks that attest to this, just as early jazz history's well-known tales of racial proximities, cultural expropriations, black skin and white noise forever remind us. But it's that opening phrase, that glissando, the sliding transition. Sliding transition, as my dear colleague Brian King calls it, a citational gesture that swiftly threads together New Orleans woodwind lyricism with klezmer ascent. It's that glissando that holds my attention, fascinates and frustrates me, and is to me the key to understanding something deeply submerged, yet ever so central to what would become the most influential, the most well-known, most lasting folk opera of all time. That 1924 Gershwin sound is to me such a key element of the aesthetics that would come to shape Porgy and Bess. It is an everything seed of opportunity and vision for this composer, rather than mere whimsical sonic mischief as it is so often treated by critics. The synecdoche to the secret history of Black womanhood and sonic modernity, as I hear it, that yet still receives scant mention in Gershwin studies and in studies of cultural modernisms more broadly. That sound is to me the place where Michael North's classic claims about white linguistic rebellion through racial ventriloquism meet up with Farrah Griffin's equally landmark observations about the spectacle of sonic Black women as the hinge by which a nation comes to define itself as resuscitated and renewed, as resilient, shiny, and new. It is the sound of a racially engendered idea about jazz, about America's modern music that white male composers, conductors, and critics would cook up together in tucks and tails deep in the heart of the 1920s concert hall, a place where they could sublimate all sorts of complicated impulses, ideologies, and desires in pursuit of their own self-aggrandizing innovation. This musical moment in the concert hall is, as I've been arguing in my work, where so much of Porgy and Bess jumps off, where the dialect of modernism, so to speak, and pace north, of course, diverges to such an extent to which we are hearing neither a pure mimicry nor excessively aestheticized Steinish racial masquerade, but rather a staged encounter between the composer and the racially feminized personification of this music, whose name bears the markings of sexual derisiveness. Jizz becomes jazz, conjured up by outsiders. This is the launching pad where the women of the so-called slum, the sisters who cut an errant path through the city, those sisters who remain abstracted dark forms in the archive that is also the white cultural imaginary, take shape as sonic allegory and comic and come aurally into view in this orchestrated rhapsody, this ecstatic piece of music that winks at, that ostentatiously flirts with the taboo blueness of Black blues life before ultimately taking flight away from the shadowy alleyway of the tenement and into the seat of the parlor. This was an unexpected sound, as Gershwin biographer Richard Crawford puts it. Not a melody, but a surprise. A reedy smear borrowed from the comic realm of jazz novelty, starting on a low F deep in the clarinet's range. Ross Gorman, Whiteman's premier soloist, played that extended throaty trill. It was perceived by the culture class as the precipice of the aspirational aesthetic avant-garde. But what's novel to some ears strikes my own as something more nagging, a musical figuration of Blackness and womanhood subtending the sonic rapture, a kind of wretched enchantment, I might call it, in as much as it signals the sound of 1920s white musicians' racialized and gendered approaches to jazz as a self-indulgent exercise in conquest and discipline. Think of esteemed music critic Walter Donrosh's infamous line in the program notes to Gershwin's 1925 Concerto in F, which I thank my friend and colleague Kenan for sharing with me, which traffics in white patriarchal cliches, the intent to quote unquote make a lady out of jazz. Or consider critic James Taylor's review in the immediate wake of the Rhapsody concert, in which he mused that quote unquote Mr. Gershwin will bear watching. He may yet bring jazz out of the kitchen. Yet the kitchen, as we know, was the field and the brothel, thus making it ever more clear that if jazz is a woman, as many a musician from Whiteman to Allington would suggest across the 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s, if jazz was either a hot thing to be tamed or a provincial servant awaiting her Pygmalion-esque calibration and transformation, if this was the undercurrent of modern music, ideologies framing the conditions of Gershwin's rise among the ranks of popular composers, then it stands to reason that one can draw a parallel between what he was up to in his swirling transduction of ideas about gendered Blackness with that of Charleston, South Carolinian DuBose Hayward's oft overlooked yet egregiously disturbing figuration of Black womanhood in his 1925 novel Porgy. Gershwin the composer and DuBose Hayward the librettist would, as I point out in my larger study, work to adapt to transpose the errant woman of the slum from the discursive realm across the novel, the subsequent play co-written by Hayward and wife Dorothy, and a Broadway hit in 1927, finally into musical theater meets opera. They would work to transcode the character of Bess in their bid to elevate jazz to the realm of the classical, to adapt a racial and gender figuration and situate it within a fully sung play whose structure, as opera critic Burden Fisher notes, incorporates the genre's inherent techniques, songs and arias, duets and ensembles, song recitatives that provide action and link its songs, leitmotif themes that provide reminiscence or identify ideas or characters, end quote. But long before he and Hayward would engage in a kind of odd and unusual cross-pollination of forms of racial mimicry, which combined urban racial caricature with that of the mythical figuration of the folk, long before all of that, Gershwin was holding fast to the idea of Black womanhood that would come to fruition in Porgy and Bess. The composer's nearly wholly overlooked 1922 blackface operetta Blue Monday, which features a scorned Black murderess hell-bent on short-circuiting another love triangle. This is work that my wonderful grad colleague Alison Chu is bringing to light right now, demonstrates his own persistent interest in the figure of Black female vice as muse. By the time he'd fallen in with Van Vechten's crowd, just as his Rhapsody star was rising, he'd made it all the more clear what his intentions were, how he intended to orchestrate Blackness to serve his own artistic designs and needs. This as well, mind you, was when Hayward's first novel would come into his view, a text that would serve to fulfill his own aesthetic desires, and one that just as crucially would archive and codify those of Hayward's, as well as the figure called by himself, as well as his critics and biographers, the greatest artistic influence on his work, and that of his mother. in their adaptation efforts, Gershwin and Hayward were developing a kind of oral, visual, and kinesthetic palimpsest of Hayward's 1925 source text. Well, let's go back to that. As well as a kind of remediation, as literary critic Linda Hutchian might have it, of that rhapsody note as well. We might think of that note, in other words, as one aesthetic gesture and an elongated Bartesian stereophony of echoes, citations, and references, emerging out of both men's racial and gender repertoires and informing the form, the content, the racial feelings subtending what would become Porgy and Bess. Hayward, for his part, had been cultivating a profile as a so-called expert on the Charleston Negro all across the 20s, and particularly from the time of the publication of Porgy to that of his 1929 novel Mama's Daughters, a kind of spin-off from his first work, abundantly apparent given both its repetition of setting, Charleston, South Carolina, and its I kid you not cameo featuring the title character of that first novel, Porgy, shows up in Mama's Daughter. Mama's Daughters magnified and multiplied Hayward's focus on what he scripts as the chaos, the excesses, the transgressiveness of Black women characters in particular. And while there's not enough space in this talk to move at length through the extensive textual details of either Porgy or Mama's Daughters, I do want to pause here to flag a recurring set of tropes in Hayward's early pair of novels that come to bear on the opera, tropes which our sister artists have forever since been strategizing ways to stretch, to diffuse, to get out from under this representational maelstrom in order to make their own felt proclamations of the new, and to likewise announce a patent refusal to sustain the regime of brutality so normalized within the Gershwin and Hayward repertoire. DuBose Hayward, as we know, nearly never regarded now as an artist of worth in 21st century literary circles, since contemporary criticism has little patience for nor interest in the crudities of what amounts to profoundly inelegant, aesthetically unsophisticated, and often morally reprehensible prose. But it's my thinking that his work demands, I mean, you should be grateful that I'm reading this instead of you. Okay. But it's my thinking that his work demands to be taken more seriously if we're to understand and say something more about the violence driving both the form and content of Porgy and Bess. That violence emanates in his first novel from the figure of a ruined woman who first appears as detritus in the landscape of the novel Porgy set in Charleston. Quote, through the early night, we are told by the narrator, a woman had lain in the dust against the outer wall of Mariah's cookshop. She was extremely drunk and unpleasant to look upon. Exactly when she had dropped or been dropped there, no one knew. Porgy had not seen her when he had driven in his goat cart at sunset, but he had heard some talk of her among those who had entered later. One of the men had come in laughing. I seen Crown's Bess outside, he said. Must be she come round to look for end quote. Casual racial misogyny is endogenous to Hayward's homegrown literary aesthetics. I've discussed this at length elsewhere. It shapes his strategy of characterization, operates as the engine of his plot, and fuels the suspense, framing his narrative involving the Bess, Crown, and Porgy triangle. The repetition of her falls in the narrative extend to the aforementioned point of violation at the hands of Crown and onto her ultimate recidivism, turning back to narcotics and finally fleeing for the big city with her pimp. Bess is caught in the familiar stasis of which we know so well, that which Spillers warned us all those years ago, that which freezes in meaning, takes on a constancy, and assumes the look and the effects of the eternal, end quote. She's the unruly archetype of Hartman and Griffin's wayward, wild, too fast universe of study, the pop culture transduction of those social documents and data that eviscerate the human, convert them into statistical persons, and reduce them to human excrescence of social law in the slum. She is the kind of figure that historians like Sarah Haley and Cheryl Hicks, of course, remind are a target of urban and penal reform. She's the kind of woman who one imagines at play's end could end up on the path to a life defined by the exploitative carnal. And she was in part a key vehicle for Hayward's success as both a novelist and playwright. No wonder then that he would double down on his strategies of blackened womanhood with the success that it hath brought for him. He therefore returned 2 years after the Porgy Broadway play to his perceptions of Gullah gender formations for inspiration in writing Mama's Daughters, another Charleston-based narrative set in the early 20th century and principally centering on two sets of families, the Haywardish Wentworth clan, which is a major street in Charleston for people who visited there, white paternalists with nothing more than a surname and lost wealth and glory in the wake of the war, and a trio of Black women headed by matriarch Mamba, her daughter Hagar, and Hagar's young one, Lisa. The coarseness and the expressive absurdities, the venal transactions between these characters are manifold here. Reading Mamba's Daughters in 2023 feels both like a relentless assault on one's spirit and as though one is caught up in a recycled Frankenstein's monster, poorly rendered mimic of all the colorline novels, the Pudd'nhead Wilsons, the Marrow of Traditions, all of the South Shall Ride Again epics, the Klansmen, the Gone with the Winds, all of the tragic mulatto and mulatto tales, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, and Imitation of Life. And some of these texts had yet to even been written yet, Life specifically. But Hayward had a way of channeling the zeitgeist of his time into awkwardly written and awkwardly conceived fiction that sated his appetite for his version of Black familial and communal life, of which he nurtured an interest since he'd been a child. His affection for his characters bespeaks a contradictory aesthetic that snakes through his entire oeuvre and that of his Low Country peers, this familiar elixir of racial fascination and desire and pity and melancholia and disgust. We hear it in the opening lines of the novel, which frame the title character as a literal menace to society. It was no mere chance that during the first decade of the new century brought Mamba out of the darkness of the underworld into the light of the Wentworth's kitchen, armed only with an enormous and devious experience and a remarkable histrionic talent. She selected her point of attack, end quote. We hear it in the musical moment when Hagar sings to baby Lisa early in the narrative, quote unquote, a sad little lullaby full of minors. Hush, little baby, don't you cry, mother and father born to die, end quote. A full stop vulgar version of the classic infant's summertime bedtime song he'd penned for his opera 6 years later. It is a song that bespeaks Hayward's social death contract with his Black characters, whom he both abhors and adores. The ugliness of caricature is so raw. Oh, I'm sorry, we're behind there. The ugliness of character is so raw and abrasive, and poor again, Mamba's Daughter, so at times painfully inscrutable, that one could easily find its realist, naturalist, blackface, anti-modernist, racial pastoralism both repellent and also presume it to be a buffoonish minor note in interwar cultural history, a mere building block on the road towards the more artistically aspirational refinement efforts of the opera. But all of Hayward's work, its attention to the putative language, social mores, the people, and particularly women at the center of his universe, conveys something crucial about not just his efforts to approximate, capitalize on, and profit off of the exotic Black peoples all around him in Charleston, but to engage in what he often loudly pronounced as a kind of preservationist work that was likewise dedicated to historical revisionism, restoration, and the long-tail postbellum Southern reconciliation politics that would shape his life ethos. Here in a city steeped in the architecture and language of ruin, DuBose Hayward turned to his invented Black women characters as his own twistedly conceived rhapsodic notes on a scale which he devised to repair that which he felt had been lost to him, his family, his city. The city of Charleston's ominous past saturates the texture of Hayward's work. His literary vision, his very reason for seeking recourse in textual forms, novels, and poetry that he used as the terrain on which to struggle mightily and both consciously and unconsciously with the heaviness of the history all around him. As the one-time largest and most consequential port for human trafficking in North America from 1670 up until the 1808 federal ban on the importation of humans, as a city whose trade and marketing of human beings resulted in vast amounts of wealth held by a planter class and poured into the architectural splendor and beauty that drew a stark contrast with the quotidian torture and subjugation of enslaved peoples, the people whose bodies supplied the capital for Charleston's sumptuousness and whose excruciating physical labor resulted in the realization of its grandeur. As a city spectacularly characterized by man-made and natural ruin, all kinds of catastrophic disasters that, as local historian Lee Jones Handel has put it, brought one of the wealthiest and cosmopolitan cities, cosmopolitan if you overlook the feudal barbarism of slavery, to its knees. Charleston remains a loud and imposing character in Hayward's oeuvre. The ruin all around him in the form of centuries of repeated and calamitous hurricanes recorded as far back as 1686 and stretching, of course, into our contemporary era. The ruin in the form of great conflagrations, devastating earthquakes, and corrosive epidemics that ravaged the masses. Ruin, of course, in the form of the Civil War, the War of Winterian Man, that which leveled major edifices of power in the city and, of course, ravaged large swaths of the South. The legacies of said natural cataclysms, as well as the weather, pays Christina Sharp, that the West hath wrought on Black peoples was the world that made Hayward, and it was what he both pointedly and inadvertently recorded in his prose. Here in this place, where a catastrophe of many kinds sat side by side with one another, DuBose Hayward would transpose these tropes of ruin in his environment onto the physical and moral attributes of his barbarous Black characters, sketch and hyperbole, disabled vagabond, murderous carnal outcast, wayward woman. There was, of course, a propagandistic impulse driving his commitment to what would become known as the Charleston Renaissance in the 1920s. In his professional ascent to moving in the late 1910s from working as a cotton checker on the Charleston docks, the year of the Powder Keg 1919 race riots that hit his city and dozens upon dozens of others all across the nation that year, as he co-led Charleston's cannon building effort, that city's busy and prolific poetry society, as he actively participated in the, kid you not, all-white local Negro spiritual society. DuBose Hayward clarified his literary vision and intent as a writer committed to the cultural arm of the Southern Reconciliation Project. Hayward's form of nostalgia was particular, though, and it also wore its influences heavily on its sleeve. I have, for instance, speculated elsewhere about the extent to which the one and only fleeting Harlem Renaissance darling of the avant-garde experimentalist novelist Gene Toomer in his 1923 masterpiece Cain may have played a role in Hayward's floundering to approximate some aspect of the affective economy of his doomed characters in Porgy. For Toomer was, for a hot minute, the sole Negro member of the South Carolina Poet Society before its members discovered that he was Negro. Cain would have served as a rich model for Hayward to mine the figure of the melancholic Black women, the Corinthas and the ferns, the ones whose skin like dusk you can barely see. Oh, can't you see it? As the sun goes down, the ones whose eyes said to men that they were easy, quote unquote. We could only speculate about the extent to which Hayward drew from Cain's ravishing, complex, and often enigmatic portraiture of Southern Black women entangled with the forces of rural Jim Crow life, coming apart at its seams. Women who, as Gail Jones writes in her important reading of the text, are as double-edged and contradictory as any blues. But the nature of his prose and fiction would seem to suggest that he likely mustered, at best, an obtuse reading of what Black women of Toomer's Georgia or his own South Carolina, for that matter, wanted, needed, or wished for out of life. If his own assessments and published essays from this period tell us anything, we know how pitifully limited his imagination was when it came to envisioning Black folks' life worlds. But for them, Hayward lamentedly pondered in his 1923 think piece article entitled, "And Once Again, the Negro." I experienced a profound sadness. I'm going into an accent, I'm sorry. Are they an eon behind or an eon ahead of us? Okay. Swiftly soon after, he cast his lot with the former idea, turning like Gershwin to Black womanhood and turning literary Black womanhood illicit and socially dangerous in a moment of creative emergence in his career, coterminous with his Northern future colleague, and in the era when both Toomer was breaking through and when, lest we forget, Bessie was breaking out on Columbia with formidable and dazzlingly nuanced statements about Black women's interior life. The comfort and safety of Charleston's insular artist community was an antidote to all those puzzles and abstractions Black artists were producing about themselves. There he found friends and looked to one familiar and overwhelmingly powerful influence to help him to find his way. The so-called Charleston Renaissance of the late 1910s and 20s sees the concept of artistic rebirth that long post-Reconstruction era city residents hope to will into being as a source of economic revitalization, tourist industry, a way to reignite white regional pride and to reclaim the purported glory of their once grand city. They took inspiration from wildly popular postbellum white denizens of Black folkloric culture like Joel Chandler Harris, as well as Klan fan fiction writers like Thomas Nelson Page, and ran with it. And for the sake of time, I'll make only quick reference to these figures here, but I'm happy to discuss them further with you. Maybe happy is not the word, but during the Q&A, right? So keep in mind the presence of folks like journalist Ambrose Gonzalez, whose publications are littered with condescension, open repulsion, and disparagement towards the gullah folk he claimed to know so well. Two of Hayward's immediate Low Country peers, Elizabeth O'Neill Verner and Alice Huger Smith, the former Verner, a sketch artist based in Charleston and an active member of the Poetry Society of South Carolina, came to fame by way of her paintings of Black men and especially the women of the city, particularly the Gullah street vendors and flower ladies. She went on to supply the illustrations for the 1928 Charleston edition of Porgy. And in her work, we see a recurring theme in Low Country art. Of this era, an interest in, a fixation on, a return again and again and again to portraits of solitary Black women, women who appear to us through slavery's framing mechanism, pejoratively referred to as mamas, figures entangled in Verner's gauzy memories of Black domestic servantry in the long-gone antebellum home. The more violently nostalgic of these two peers of his is Alice Ravenel Huger Smith. They all have such long names. Known primarily for her watercolor paintings and sketches of Charleston architecture in rural South Carolina, Smith was an active lost cause art propagandist. What is intriguing to me is just how deeply an artist like Smith, I'm happy to go back to any reason, yoked together projects on plantation memories on the decaying Charleston architecture and the Black women figures forever embedded in the land. Frozen in time, wandering in the rubble in an endless cycle of work, they are repositories of desires that deserve our attention and the makings of what would become a behemoth operatic event that give us a deeper prehistory to what ended up on stage at the Alvin Theater come 1935. And women like Werner and Smith circled round and round ways of depicting Gullah culture in their visual art. And the impact of the work can be felt in Hayward's fiction, the melding of the two, crumbling Charleston ruins and Black peoples living under the heel of racialized socioeconomic deprivation is a staple of Hayward's Porgy projects, from the novel's opening pages, through the staging of the play, through that infamous set design of the opera, Catfish Row and its classic rendering in the 1935 production. Forward is the spectacle of Black folks enduring like Faulkner's Dilsey in the midst of a hollowed out environment, though famously and pointedly excised from the 2012 Parks and Paulus revival, for which they were critiqued for taking away Catfish Row. Veneer and Smith, they were, as it turns out, just two of a whole host of white women Charlestonians busy producing local color as regionalist advertising in the 1910s and 20s, generating material that might entice visitors to the city as part of an early 20th century large-scale investment on the part of the Charleston tourism industry. That's still going strong. Some 100 years later, I can vouch for that, having just been there. One woman stood out from the pack. When Janie Scrubbin DuBose Hayward walked into a Victor Talking Machine Company recording studio in 1923, her hustle was already more than a decade strong. She'd been hoofing it as a South Carolinian widow since 1888, scraping together ways to support her grade school children, one daughter, one often sickly son who stuck close to her, absorbing her life choices with a fascination that would become manifest in his own adulthood. For the once wealthy and now destitute white citizens of Charleston, South Carolina, who were living in the long shadow of the war of Northern aggression, decisions had to be made about how to survive in a city made prosperous by that massive slave economy and now crumbling under the weight of its own de rigueur, anti-Black systems of hierarchy, crushingly exploitative hiring practices, grossly unequal housing and educational resources, widespread tolerance of racial terror, the usual combo platter of conditions plaguing the post-Reconstruction era South. But Charleston, that commercial metropolis that once ruled the roost of Atlantic slave trade commerce and corruption, was its own particular fallen world of contradictions, devastated by the boll weevil, and yet eerily grand in its still standing colonial architecture, controlled by white lapsed aristocrats, and yet demographically dominated by Black folk, people of African descent whose distinct Gullah customs were a thing of obstinate beauty in the face of centuries of captivity and human commodification. The specificity and insularity of language and tales, the food and music passed around and preserved on the local sea islands by those people whom Curtis Mayfield might lyrically refer to as darker than blue, were vernacular phenomena in Charleston, where racial lines of division were frequently and casually transgressed by white city dwellers. They were the ones we might think of who proved Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographic theory regarding the absence of the concept of privacy for Black people. Janie Scrubbin DuBose Hayward was one of those many low country raconteurs who never comprehended that concept, instead turning what one unreconstructed historian explains away as her grief-induced fascination with the Gullahs, her discovery of their exotic subculture, into a lucrative form of employment, and one that transformed her into a local celebrity who both capitalized on and helped to drive the burgeoning Charleston tourist industry at the turn of the century. There were Gullah songbooks and lyric pamphlets to be published, lectures on the supposed ways of this Negro ethnic group to be given, and poems, sketches, and songs to be composed as odes to what Hayward saw in these people, this alien race who were an obvious and convenient synecdoche for her nostalgic longings and intimate desires. Consumed with grief in the wake of husband Ned's death in a rice mill, Janie Scriven Dubose Hayward, long ass name, threw herself into a pastime she'd already been nurturing in those early years of motherhood, keeping obsessive documentation and memorialization of her abruptly aborted domestic bliss, collecting newspaper clippings of bereavement activities, storing away gardening notes, and finally recipes and family recipes, and composing florid grief poetry that she stuffed along with dried flowers into leather-bound and fabric-laced albums, no doubt stepping into the customs of widowhood, which would have been quite familiar to her growing up in the war-soaked Confederate South. But traces of the professional direction in which she would head in and leap out into in her earliest commonplace book journal, in an entry from June 1890, quote, "The Negroes who worked with him, husband Ned," she noted, dizzy with self-congratulatory pride and sorrow, "simply idolized him. Here in these pages, we see the beginnings of the drift, the rehearsal, the resolve, the assurance derived by way of the slipping on," as the great Sophia would say. She was still several years away from building a blackface repertoire all her own. But these are the first signs in her writing of a penchant for racial voicings, which commingles across these early notebooks with odes to the Confederate slain and short Gothic nightmare sketches involving Negro soldiers. Something was brewing in her home at the turn of the century at her gotta pay the bills boarding house dubbed Tranquility, and bustling with fresh spates of tourists. Late at night, around the edges of the day, or first thing in the morning, she stole time to begin building her act on scraps of paper, whatever she could find, jotting down notes for what would become one in a long string of routines, published poetry, sketchbooks, and works of short fiction. There were the obsessions with Booker T and his dinner at the White House, a ripe source of mockery that would appear in multiple repertoires. There were the list of short jokes, the Gullah streetcars, the memorialization of her own publication successes, repeatedly affixing certain poems like Darwinite, which played racial taxonomies for laughs. Let's see. All right, guys. There's Darwinite. There were maudlin odes to displaced children. Keep going, come back to these. Torn from their families and clinging to sole possessions. Odes upon odes. Odes upon odes to the Black women in her midst, which she carried into her first published collection of poetry. Oh, there's Porgo. Okay, sorry, a little behind. This is the dispossessed children holding onto a doll named Porgo. Lots of ideas about the way that name traveled. Let's see. There were all of the different odes to the Black women in her midst, including My Name, which she carried into her first published collection of poetry, Wild Roses, in 1899. Out of the ashes of family's destitution and nursing the wounds of planter grievances, Janie Hayward transformed herself into a writer as well as a performer who revitalized Blackface sentimentality through an impaired appreciation for the Gullah day laborers all around her, the wistful memories of the enslaved servants who populated her childhood. This she sought to document in her career as a dialect performer and as a successful local author as the 1910s rolled on, and in her 1912 pamphlet, also Songs of the Charleston Darky, in which she aimed to render and print the romance of her racist imagination. Her most inflammatory work in this regard would surface in her pseudo-fictional prose collected in the volume Brown Jackets, which appeared in the aforementioned consequential year of 1923. Again, moving quickly through this, just to give you an example. Brown Jackets, a white supremacist journey into domesticity, wherein the altruisms of Black women servants are measured, Miss Ophelia style, by their white hearts, by their tireless commitment to supplying hyper-efficient ease and care to their white employers, by their sorceress-like abilities to bring order and cleanliness to every crevice of old Mrs. Home. These are the desires and the obsessions of the long gone big house mistresses, the women who, as Stephanie Jones Rogers has shown, were everywhere in the market culture of slavery, studying its fluctuations, blending into the crowds that surrounded public auctions, blocks, and courthouse steps as enslaved people were exposed for sale. This is where I'm going to start jumping a little bit. Okay. The meaning of this revival of those supposedly long gone days in the 1910s and 20s and even 30s repertoire of Janie Hayward has, of course, everything to do with the pursuit of the repossession of lost capital by way of performance, the means to seizing back lost Confederate contraband by way of surrogation. Beyond the protocols of love and theft, Janie's evolving interest in first dialect literature and then dialect performance appears to me to be a profoundly intimate yet multifaceted attempt to engage in both economic futurity for her family through financial solvency and through a kind of exemplary mode of aesthetics, which she successfully passed down a generation to her son. A sui generis history, for sure, in the legacies of blackface. It was seemingly an almost obsessive attempt at the restoration of the blackness, the black womanhood of her bygone years that she deemed her rightful property. How else to explain this archival object? A keepsake, a challenge, an object to spark artistic motivation, affixed to the front page of notebook after notebook after notebook of Janie Hayward's set piece materials, draft ideas for programs, and scrapbooks of her own press coverage and published materials is the portrait of a woman without a proper name, without a context, without a history, without a program of her own, presumably colorized by forces most likely not of her own making, and assigned the boorishly predictable title of Mammy in small printed script at the lower left bottom of the image. She appears sanguine, if possibly from the standpoint of these 21st century Black feminist eyes, just a tad bit tired, immaculately dressed in what could also be perceived as drawing room wear if it weren't for the headscarf, the sartorial mark of being forever on the clock and worlds away from leisure. Here she appears as a nameless muse, the keenly specific source material for the pronounced and splashy leap that Janie Hayward would make into the world of performing as a darky recitalist, quote unquote. And do a little leap here. She did all of this while mothering and mentoring a son who saw fit to follow her into the family biz and whose distinct brand of artistry rested in part on translating the docility of his mother's blackface characters into danger and profligacy. This was the way that mother and son would survive and defeat the downward spiral of Charleston's white planter culture in the postbellum years. This was the project that rose out of all that low country experimentation with Black women's caricature. This was the laboratory where the invention of Gershwin and Hayward's sonic Black womanhood began to take shape. The younger Hayward's respective star turn, one that eclipsed his mama's celebrity, was rooted in the intimacies of what his mother taught him, the missionary and heathen role-playing games that Janie documented playing with her child as a way to shoo away the grief. One imagines what he had to have overheard and listened out for in the Hayward family home as she perhaps rehearsed her sets, practiced the grotesqueries and absurdities of caricature and butchered Black speech, experimenting with dialectical neologisms as they rolled off her tongue, as they spilled onto the page, as they may have taken shape in the front of the microphone at Victor. This woman's work became the scaffolding for a stratospherically successful career in DuBose Hayward's own right, trafficking in a dense tangle of mythologies attached to the Blackness, which he would spin into fame that far exceeded his mother's, and one that he would export globally, drafting into the service generations of Black women performers to realize his vision. These sisters, we know, though, would not go quietly. And so a quick coda, looking at the timer. What are the ways to tell the tale of Black women artists' inevitable interventions in their own cultural domination, their own rejection of the violence of poor game best? We might look to the libretto itself and then turn to several examples of artists, across the generations who've refused the constrictions of an archetype shaped by many forces. How did the sisters get out from under this? And what a thing it would be in Gershwin and Hayward studies and beyond if we actually paid more attention to the network of strategies improvised by extraordinary cycles of artists and performers who for nearly a century now have broached and sustained a conversation with a single text. Think of the generations of Black women artists who found ways of scoring the conditions and possibilities of being aesthetically on the edge, the ones who turned the outside of Bess's condition in the novel from a sentencing and into a way out, passing that secret on to the ones who follow the paths that they paved. The libretto finds Bess so often outside of the sonic grandeur of the score, instead listening, contemplating, fretting, imagining. We find her listening to Clara's opening summertime song before finally finding the opportunity to sing it herself in the final act, listening to Porgy's proclamations of love, to Crown's increasingly menacing come-ons, to Sport and Life's call for her to follow him to New York. In that surfeit of listening and that absorption of voices singing lullabies, love songs, and temptation songs to her, she is a character who persistently teeters on the edge of multiple competing demands before falling out of the narrative altogether. But we might yet perhaps read the role of Bess as an opportunity to do outsider art, not the kind that presumably exists outside of the protocols of artistic training, that emerges without, and in spite of structured cultures of study, and that proudly embraces no guidance with regards to institutionalized aesthetic practices, that lives in the realm of the so-called naive approaches to aesthetic reduction, all of which are standard characteristics of that which is often referred to as outsider art. The artists of the Porgy and Bess archive are, however, breaking convention with regards to the Gershwin and Hayward blueprint of this character in sometimes subtle, other times strikingly, compellingly resourceful and innovative ways that work the aesthetics of being far outside of what the composer and original librettist imagined for this character. I'm not going to talk about Grace Bumbry. It was just one of the great Brechtian interpretations of Bess that you'll ever see. Happy to talk about that. I do want to say quickly some things about Clamma Dale, who in her classic and pivotal interpretation of Bess in the Houston Opera's 1976 production seemingly took to heart the principles of the outside that feel very Morrisonian to me. Recall that it was Morrison who in her very first novel marked the distinctions between outside versus being put outdoors. There's a difference, Morrison writes in a legendary line in the Blue Star, being put out and being put outdoors. If you are put out, you go somewhere else. If you are outdoors, there is no place to go. The distinction was subtle but final. Outdoors was the end of something, an irrevocable physical act of finding and complementing our metaphysical condition, end quote. For Dale, the daughter of jazz musicians, a boss sister who allegedly clashed with musical director Ella Gerber over the comedic interpretation of the material during a run in the 1974 LA version of the opera musical, Bess was a character to be reckoned with precisely because of the outer limits she plumbs. By the time that she would reprise the role 2 years later, she had, according to theater critic Alpert, developed a full philosophy involving the quote-unquote opera pivoting around Bess, which is the way I think Dale would speculate Gershwin wanted it. She's the only new element in the life of Catfish Row. She's extremely vulnerable, she continues, but has somehow, as most Black women have always had, an ability to survive. My silent script for her is that she had to leave home. She had to survive and had to hustle, not just as a prostitute, but hustle the way I do as an artist, doing church jobs, temple jobs, children's jobs to keep herself together. She also, Dale adds, represents a threat to everyone around her, even the people of Catfish Row. Okay. I talk a little bit about the relationship between what Dale was doing and the arrival of Sula in 1973. We're not going to do that right now, but it's worth keeping in mind the Morrisonian theory. And so let us wrap up here by getting here. Dale, Bumbry, MacDonald, I think of all of them as part of a larger movement, one involving not just the women working within the production, but those who always were drawn to doing more with this work by placing themselves outside of it. Consider Zora, who just 2 years after Gershwin and Hayward dropped their original on us, gave to the world a wholly original, strikingly granular work of literary genius that, upon reread, seems to so clearly converse with, aggressively rethink, at times dramatically interrupt, renovate, and fundamentally transform the Porgy and Bess narrative while leaving intact core tropes: a trio of men, a convention-resistant woman, a lethal hurricane, an investment in dialect, yet here, of course, showcased with Hurstonian depth and sophistication and put both in the service of preserving folkloric tradition and operating in relief of exquisite, riveting, and commanding free and direct discourse. Or consider Kara Walker's 2012 darkly imprinted reconjuring of the libretto, published by San Francisco's Orion Press. I always almost call it Arian Press, and it's not that. Okay. And it's inspired by the Parks, Paulus MacDonald, and Alicia Hall Moran production. Walker's renovation of Porgy and Bess, so uncharacteristic of her most iconic silhouette work, amounts to an effort to return to the mother source that connects her to this opera. Says Walker, quote, "It seemed to her in her childhood that there was something important about this music, and Mom had a particularly private conversation happening with it," end quote. In paying homage to a work important to her mother, Walker pursued an approach both similar to and distinct from her most famous styles. Though her Porgy and Bess figures are like so many of her graphic studies, unable to break free in one way or another from the apocalyptic and apocryphal legacies of slavery. Here Walker describes how she simply let her paper cutout caricatures be, quote unquote, while also alluding to these archetypes' full dimensions by rubbing, quote unquote. This pressure, as she calls it, was a way in which to begin unpacking the signifiers of Porgy and Bess, to place the text outside of its discursive, its theatrical, its sonic home environments, and to do so with mindfulness and care so as to pursue the quiet mystery of her mother's attachment to it through a visual grammar that alludes to both the weight and depth of the history which these figures are hauling with them. Or consider the original Bess, the late great Anne Brown, first Black student ever admitted to Juilliard, all of 23 when she won the role after a spirited audition with Gershwin. Consider not only Brown's germinal impact on the show from within its cast, inspiring many a theater historian has noted Gershwin's decision to change the production's title to Porgy and Bess and driving him to hand Bess a final solo reprise of Summertime in the show. Consider the long and still under-theorized rich history of Brown's work as an expat in Europe, married to a Norwegian Olympic ski jumper and returning to this show many decades later on the outside and in a dramaturgical role, lobbying for the interpolation of a strangely obstreperous lost scene, one that director Ruben Mamelian had experimented with, including in the original Broadway show. I don't have some of the notes that she made with me, but I can talk more about them. She was trying to lobby for this scene to be included in the Danish production of Porgy and Bess. Looking in on the show with the distance of age, time, and geography, Brown sought a way to shake the sonic foundations of Porgy and Bess, to call attention to the grammar of noise that these characters invoked in the midst of all of this admixture of operatic mellifluousness and the kitchen economics of white ideas about jazz. In the archive, we find her efforts, though ultimately dissuaded by the Danish production team, to turn inside out the spectacle of jungle cacophony that white composers imagined hearing in Black music, the thing they needed to tame. Way out on the frozen tundra of Scandinavia in the late 1960s, Anne Brown was imagining riotous excess, a raising. Brown's is both a raising and a renovation project, a resolve to perform through and beyond the ruins of what's left behind, to stay the course like Circe and Song of Solomon, to hold the line in the long-gone aristocrat's crumbling mansion, wandering its halls, claiming this real estate as her own, and finally, of course, consider the dozens upon dozens of Black women musicians who've turned again and again to the Gershwin and Hayward songbook as a form of rigorous recovery, the antidote to domination. There are numerous examples here, many of which I've returned to again and again, but the newest performance that comes to us, one released from the vaults of time just this past summer, is what I'd like to leave you with, I promise, today. A reading of I Love You, Porgy by Nina.
I love
At her Lost set in 1966 Newport Jazz Festival. Situated in a repertoire of love songs that run the gamut of love for a people to love for an intimate, as Shana Redbin points out in her liner notes for the album. This version of the song, in which Simone first broke onto the charts in 1959, is here slowed down to an almost complete halt. In the sanctuary of the Quashi quiet, we are with her, hovering in the pauses, hugging the place that in these original lyrics, in that original hot mess of a narrative, is the refuge, the stillness, the certitude of tenderness, that which my colleague Erica Edwards refers to as a powerful holding. To take Black women out of the exhibit, as Edwards puts it, out of the experiment, out of a dominant art, we might add musical theater tradition, and place them in lovingly crafted compositions and cover performances that constitute an epic project of gathering. This impulse is for Edwards a reminder of what Gail Jones again has taught us, that quote unquote perhaps brutality enables one to recognize what tenderness is, end quote. For Edwards, a tenderness is what an archive can invite, a finding, a pulling together of all that is broken, not in the interest of wholeness, but rather in the interest of holding a beholding, end quote. This beholding, this counter-holding, as I might add, which we hear in the round with Simone, is offered as a felt and gorgeous response to that which occurs in the clutches of another's hot hands. It is a rejection of dying deep inside her when Bess is called outside her name, and is put into play by a musician who circled round and round Gershwin and Hayward for much of her career. She extends to us here the possibility of existing, of being together in another time, in the drawn-out tempo and temporality of an artist who's long known that the sisters We're going to have to keep writing and rewriting show tunes for the shows that haven't been written yet. The kinds that exercise a long and torturous, and seemingly never ending history of violence. She locates a gentle place beyond the representational carnage, beyond the ruins, an effective life world beyond either the rhapsodic or the state of ruin. If we hold still, we can be there too. Thank you so much for your patience.
You can keep me. On a stick. Few days after forever is done, with you forever.
Whatever people like. I will just say, because it's like, shut up now. I gotta don't talk anymore. The thing I want to say again is that I hold this intellectual community in such high regard. It is such a special place. So I just appreciate being in the room with all of you. So. Sure. Anything you like. People aren't worn out. You should ask them, not me.
Hi, thank you so much for that amazing talk. This is just a really small question. You sort of used the word transduction in your talk about
Yes, I did.
twice, and I was wondering if you could sort of say a little bit more about what do you mean to mobilize with that word?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was like kind of a gut theory that I've held on to for a long time. And it's sort of inspired by Jason King's work that he did a long time ago. Really great piece on Tony Braxton's thermal diamond dynamics. I mean, Jason King, now the head of the Annenberg School at USC, has this incredible body of work around thinking about sort of the different kind of environmental workings of Black popular music culture. So I've been thinking about that piece and thinking about heat transduction and thinking about just kind of an evolution of one form into another, right? And I think really Jason does this much better than I do, and kind of taking apart a kind of a theory of a certain kind of aesthetics that he identifies as having a temperature to it, right? And that's not what I was doing, but there's a part of this work that really lingers on and tries to work through adaptation and all of the different forms of organ bass, and so I think that it started there. I was trying to think about all of the different ways we can kind of imagine the transmogrification of all of these different sounds and networks of listening and sonic improvisation that becomes something else. So thank you for that question. Let's all go back to Jason King on that one. So thank you. Don't we want to just listen to Nina Simone? Yeah. Hey, Roshi.
Thanks so much for that, Daphne. You had a just kind of few words in a sentence that I was really gripped by, and I would love to hear you elaborate on this because it just seems so foundational to much of the work that you do and those of us who work in popular music studies do.
Yes.
And you said repossession of lost capital in the form of culture.
Yeah. Yeah. The
That
whole ball game, baby. Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
It's to sum up this phenomenon in such a way is really poignant, and I would love for you to elaborate on that.
Thank you, Roshi, so much. Thank you for giving that back to me. I mean, that is really just what I was really living with this person, the mother, for so long now, was really trying to map this sort of affective, sort of comportment of loss and grief you know, that is also constitutive of a region and a time, right? And there's a part of this work that I didn't share that's about how she's exceptional, but she's not alone. Like there's a whole like, you know, culture of white women who are doing this kind of work. And it seemed to me that I got closer to just thinking about, especially, and Stephanie's work has just been really helpful to me in thinking about this, about the figure of the mistress and trying to sort of repossess, you know, not only your identity, but, you know, property, obviously. And to do that by way of performance, a lot of us have talked about that in other contexts before. But this seems like a particular phenomenon because it was so granular in terms of how it was, you know, lifting these kinds of readings of these, you know, forced laborers, readings of their identities and their actions, you know, kind of vampirizing them, you know, as a way to fill in the gap of, you know, that lost sort of financial solvency, you know, both affectively, but also literally, materially, you know. So it's just kind of a crazy phenomenon that I wanted to pay more attention to because it's all around us. Also, I mean, this isn't quite what you're asking, just to emphasize, like, this is not a hidden thing. Like, she's hidden in plain sight. Like, people in Gershwin studies or Hayward studies, which is really scary stuff, right? They make reference to her all the time, what her livelihood was, but nobody does anything. There are like 12 boxes of her sketchbooks that are insane. And there's one scholar, he's been writing about her since the 70s, and he popped up at the archive when I was there. And, you know, he was the one who was like, you know, well, I don't think she had a racist bone in her body. And I'm like, wow, you know, right. But so I guess I'm just trying to put pressure on, you know, recontextualizing, obviously, what we do in Black studies, recontextualizing what this work meant with regards to the afterlives of slavery. Like, they just don't do that. And it's just right there. So let's all get in there. Let's all go to Charleston, which is a trip. So anybody here from Charleston? By the way, anybody? Yeah. Oh my God. Wow. They still have horse-drawn carriages. Yeah, no, it's really something. But the Atlantic World Museum is extraordinary. It's beautiful. Oh. It's late. Yeah. Janet Jackson. Yeah.
Quotation from yourself.
Yeah. Oh.
Beautiful. I'll think about it. I was wondering about something else you said when you said, when you said something like, I am not trying to analogize or equate the labor of forced labor
Yes.
with cultural labor on the stage, but
Yes.
maybe you're not analogizing,
Right.
but is it all wrapped up in what you are doing in that relationship with this quote?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, we like to talk about entanglements. So, right, it's definitely they're entangled with one another. Like I say, I wanted to just be very sensitive to this kind of, you know, what the trauma of surrogation, you know, is I don't want to conflate the trauma, right, of the surrogation with an actual violation across the centuries of bodies and peoples. But it's a psychological, you know, trauma. I mean, I felt the heaviness when I saw my name and her, you know, right? It's just really the best thing I could do was go to the museum the next day. So I do think, you know, that's another place where we can sit with this material. Because, right, it's interwoven to the cultural fabric of our lives. I mean, I probably would make a lot of enemies here, but I have thoughts about Taylor Swift that I'm not, I'm sorry, about just like cultural domination and whiteness. And so it's just to say that these things work on us in all sorts of ways. Sorry, Swifties. I'm like, you know, I don't know. I have a lot of, yeah, anyways, I hope that kind of, you know. Thank you, Stephen Best. Thank you.
It's really lovely to have you here and to hear your work.
Well, I'm honored. I really am. Oh, thank you. back on. You need more, Nina.